Hi folks, today we're going to be covering chapter 38. This is the chapter on conservation biology. So today, unlike any other period of history, we are facing an environmental challenge that we've never seen in scope before. We're talking about climate change. And what that means, that's the unprecedented speed that Earth's atmosphere is warming at this time. This has some really detrimental effects that we're already seeing some of those effects, including the melting of the polar ice caps that is in part contributing to rising sea levels. We also know that the ocean currents are warming, which we've talked already about how ocean currents help to drive weather patterns. And this is leading to more extreme weather, so more frequent and stronger hurricanes during hurricane season, heat waves in areas where it has been uncommon in the past, and increased precipitation with some of these weather events that's leading to flooding in coastal areas. So we're going to talk today about biodiversity and how biodiversity is being affected by climate change. So things like the effect on this little guy. This is sorry, my slides are not advancing there. This is the American pika. This is a rabbit relative that lives high up in the Rocky Mountains. And this is a species that's become it's evolved to be acclimated to very cold and snowy conditions. So as the climate is, the temperatures are rising in the summer and there's a whole lot less snowfall, this species is becoming threatened. So we're going to cover two main topics today. First being how climate change and this idea of the loss of biodiversity on the planet. But then we're also going to switch gears, and it's not all doom and gloom, because we're going to talk about the fields of conservation biology and restoration ecology, and how scientists are working to combat some of the negative impacts of climate change. So again, global climate change, there was a video that was posted under week 1 on some misconceptions around climate change. So if you haven't watched that, I would encourage you to go back and take a look at it. But this is a widely accepted theory that that scientists largely agree upon, that this increase in global temperatures is a result of human activities. So it's a way it's showing that our historic desire to dominate over environmental factors has had an effect on the non-human inhabitants of Earth, and it's trickling down to affect us as well. So one of the major impacts of climate change is this loss of biodiversity. And biodiversity, if you remember, we're talking about how diverse, how abundant different species are in an ecosystem. And there are three different levels of biodiversity. There's ecosystem diversity, species diversity, and genetic diversity. And we're going to talk about all three of those in the next few slides. But we want to remember that biodiversity is important for a number of factors, but also, including the fact that different species feed on different things. If there are a loss of certain species, there is a loss of food sources for other species. We make things out of biological material, things like fibers, medicines, so that some of those valuable plants that we use for medicinal purposes. Again, if we lose some of those species, we lose a major service that the ecosystem's providing to us. So when we talk about ecosystem diversity, this is one example of a very diverse ecosystem. This is the Klamath-Siskiyou wilderness area. This is in parts of California and Oregon. And this is an extremely rich it's extremely rich in ecosystem diversity. So what we mean is that there are different types of ecosystems all within this one geographic location. So there are ecosystems like the chaparral that we talked about in chapter 34. There are sequoia and redwood forests here. It has wetlands, it has salt marshes, it's on the coastal coast. Parts of it are on the coast where it has coastal dunes. So we're talking about many different types of ecosystems all within one geographic area. So this is a rich in ecosystem diversity. And as these kinds of natural systems are lost, so are some of those very essential services that we rely upon. So for example, water purification is one of the services that's provided free of charge by these kinds of systems. So as water moves, because the vegetation is so dense, the water moves very slowly through these kinds of systems, and it has a lot of time to penetrate the soil where impurities can be taken out. It can be, some of those chemical impurities can be taken up by the plants themselves, leaving very fresh, clean water. And even in places like New York City, this is the only kind of water purification that's necessary. Now, they do chlorinate the water for bacteria and microorganisms, but the chemical impurities are completely treated through this kind of vegetation treatment. So moving on to species diversity. And what we're talking about here is how many different species are in a geographic region. So there's, as these ecosystems are depleted or lost, populations of the species that make up those ecosystems also can be lost. There are a couple ways this happens. So there are these terms called extirpation, and the other that you've probably heard, extinction. So what we mean by extirpation is when a population of a species is lost from one particular community. So there may be other populations of that same species, but within one geographic location, that species has been lost, and that we refer to as extirpation. And that's a problem because it's an indication that that species is sensitive to those kinds of ecosystem changes, and it's an indication of where species may become extinct over time. And extinction, again, means that entire species has been completely wiped out. It's completely disappeared. So this graph here is showing us how the likelihood of different types of animals, how likely they are to reach this level of extinction. So the yellow at the bottom is showing that there are also already some species of each type of animal that have become extinct in the wild. The purple bar here is showing how many are likely to be are facing a high risk of extinction, mostly due to loss of biodiversity in the ecosystem. There are some species that are in trouble, but we're just kind of keeping an eye on them. And then there are also the blue bar showing the low risk of extinction. But what we see from this is that there are these purple and green parts of the graph that we refer to as rare or threatened or endangered species. So this isn't necessarily just a problem for the species that's becoming threatened or extinct. This is a picture of eastern prairie dogs, I believe, or black-tailed prairie dogs, excuse me. These guys provide a whole lot of service to their environment, to their community. They burrow in the earth to make their dens, and it alters the soil. It aerates the soil, and it provides nice soils for the vegetation, and other kinds of animals like rabbits and owls and other animals use abandoned burrows for homes. So if this species were to become removed from a community, all of those species that rely on its services would also be threatened. Okay, and so the final category of diversity that we're going to be talking about is genetic diversity. And this can be either within populations or between populations. And it's essentially refers to how a species makes adaptations to the environment through genetic variability. So if a species has very low genetic diversity, there's a whole lot less opportunity for that species to be able to change and adapt and evolve with a changing environment. So the enormous genetic diversity of all the organisms on Earth has a real great potential for us too, because we can count on these genetic adaptations as our environment's changing. So things like breeding programs that narrow the diversity of crop plants leave them more vulnerable. So if we have a real monoculture for agricultural purposes, and we've genetically altered and engineered plants to have certain characteristics, but then a pathogen moves in and that plant does not have the genetic capability to defend it against the pathogen, it'll wipe out the entire crop and that entire population. So having genetic diversity is extremely important for species to be able to have these adaptation opportunities. Okay, so now with insight into the types and importance of biodiversity, we can talk about the causes of its decline. So again, the decline in ecosystem diversity, which leads to a decline in species diversity, and there's a large connection with a loss of genetic diversity as well. Okay, so we're going to talk about a few causes of these, the impacts that we're seeing of diversity loss, and they come from a few things. Loss of habitat, invasive species, which we'll talk about what those are. I think we've introduced that already. Over-harvesting of natural resources, pollution, climate change. These are the major threats. So as humans have altered habitats, that's really our single greatest threat to biodiversity. So this is an example of habitat loss, places where we've clear-cut areas for harvesting of timber and other resources. This is, I believe, in a national forest in Washington State. And as you can see, clear-cutting this forest is going to just wipe out any kind of diversity that would be able to be sustained there. Things like invasive species. So snakes are not bad. This is a brown tree snake that is invasive to Guam. It got there by being a stowaway on cargo planes. But once it got there, its population exploded. It didn't have any predators. It has no competition for other resources, and no parasites, no natural parasites in the area that help keep this population, the snake population, in check. So Guam was very rich in bird diversity. There were 12 species of native birds that are native only to Guam, and 6 out of those 12 species of birds have been extirpated by this snake. I'm sorry, they weren't native only to Guam. The populations that were native to Guam have become extirpated by this snake, and one of them was native only to Guam, and it is actually extinct now. So invasive species outcompete. They can outcompete natural species or native species for resources. They may not have any natural predators, natural parasites and things that again help keep their populations in check. So they can severely alter a community. And we have some invasive species here, lots of invasive plant species. You may have heard of the tree of heaven, which we see quite a lot in our forests right here in Berkeley County. And it outcompetes, it grows really fast. It doesn't have anything that eats it. So it outcompetes natural vegetation for light and nutrients and other resources. We have also, there's a species called the zebra mussel that has infected our local waterways. It's, again, has nothing in the natural ecosystem around here. Uses it as a food source, so it's outcompeting habitat where other native mussels can grow and live. So again, that's habitat loss. That's invasive species. We can also we're also producing as our populations have grown and industry has become so efficient in processing things. We've been contributing a whole lot more pollutants to the ecosystems. And what happens is not only does it get into our waters and those kinds of things, it actually can get into the tissues of animals as well. And as those animals feed on other animals that have been exposed to the pollutant, we have this process of what we call biological magnification. And what that means, it's the pollutant becomes more concentrated in tissues of the animals at higher trophic levels because they're eating a larger abundance of the smaller animals that have the toxin in it. And I'll show you a couple of images that help to, I think one image here that helps to sort of illustrate what I'm talking about there. This is just a very sad picture of a brown pelican in Louisiana after the 2010 BP oil rig explosion. So it's not just that these pollutants get into the waterways in sort of an invisible way. We can have pollution that's quite hard to look at. And I'm not intending to make you look at it longer. My slides are slow again today. So this is what we're talking about. This is a sort of a graphic displaying this biological magnification. So again, how the concentration of a chemical becomes more concentrated in the tissues of the animals at the higher end of the food chain. So what we see here, we have zooplankton and phytoplankton that are being eaten by the smelt. Because the zooplankton and phytoplankton are eaten at a higher concentration, the smelt will incur more of that pollutant into their own tissues. And as those small fish are eaten by bigger fish, the pollutant becomes even more concentrated. And likewise, as the herring eats the lake trout, the concentration is becoming more concentrated. So an example of this is another reason for this is that the higher trophic levels, the species at the higher end of the food chain, also live longer. So not only are they eating more, they're eating over a longer period of time. So there's more time for the pollutant to accumulate in the tissues of the longer lived animals. There's a kind of a recommendation, for example, for pregnant women not to eat fish like tuna, because tuna live a really long time, and they have a lot more likelihood of having high levels of mercury in their tissues because of how long they're living in the food chain. Okay, so going back to another major threat to biodiversity on the planet is this overarching idea of global climate change. What we see is we have what we call greenhouse gases, and there's a rising concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Things like carbon dioxide and methane and nitrous oxide. These are all chemicals in the atmosphere that are a result of human activities, things like the burning of fossil fuels in our cars and for heating our homes, and all of the things that we burn fossil fuels for. This is this human the human connection with the increased greenhouse gases was an overarching conclusion of a group of scientists from over 100 countries that have studied this. They've published thousands of papers on this. They've developed what is called the International Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. And these are a group of scientists that have dedicated their careers to studying these climate patterns and how they change based on different types of human activities. So sorry, my slides are advancing funky. But the signature effect of these increasing greenhouse gases is a rapid increase in global temperature. It's risen about 1 degree Celsius, or almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit, since about 1900. And that might not sound like a lot, but it has that increase of a degree Celsius has had major impacts on the global temperatures, or on how the Earth has responded. So this graph here is showing us since about 1875 to about 2015, how global temperatures have it's the differences in average annual global temperatures. And again, we can see here that there's been an increase of about 1 degree Celsius. And the 10 hottest years on record have been since the late 1990s. And you can see that from 2015 on, each year gets hotter and hotter. Sorry for the slow slides advancement here. But what we do also see when we look at global temperatures, how it's distributed, temperature increases are not evenly distributed around the globe. We actually see that the largest increases are in the northmost regions of the northern hemisphere. Oh, I'm sorry. So yeah, so we can see that the hottest temperatures are actually located in the northern hemisphere, in the northern region, due largely to how the ocean currents have been influenced and warmed by this global change. And also a lot of the heat, as I mentioned, with the ocean currents, a lot of the heat that's trapped by greenhouse gases becomes stored in the ocean. And when the water warms up, not only are we melting the polar ice caps, but what the warmer water itself actually expands, which also contributes to rising sea levels in coastal regions. So the consequences of global warming include as I mentioned, the more extreme weather events like higher precipitation patterns that are bringing, we have longer and more intense droughts in some areas, lots more precipitation in other areas. And again, hurricane intensity is increasing, which because of hurricanes are driven by warmer waters in the Gulf and South Pacific areas, and those are driving more frequent and more intense hurricane seasons. So as I've already mentioned, much of the increase in greenhouse gases is as a result of burning of fossil fuels. Some of this can be absorbed by natural biological pathways, and actually can be incorporated into the biomass of some animals, or some plants. But we've reached a level of deforestation that has actually really decreased the way this carbon dioxide can be taken out of the atmosphere and stored into biomass. Some carbon dioxide can also be absorbed into the ocean waters. It becomes dissolved in the water. And when that happens, the chemical change that occurs is that it becomes what we call carbonic acid. And this has a negative impact on the organisms. It makes the water more acidic, and it uses up the carbonate ions, the ions that are necessary for organisms that make shells out of calcium carbonate, things like corals and lots of different types of plankton. Those carbonate ions that they would use to make their exoskeletons is no longer available as the carbon dioxide is dissolving into the water. So it's also leading to a loss of biodiversity in aquatic environments, not even necessarily just because of changing temperatures, but because of how the chemical reactions are occurring in the water as more carbon dioxide is available. And there have been, this has been a topic that's not new. It's new when you think of the scope of history, but we've been talking about this for many, many years, and it's becoming very well understood that we need to reduce our atmospheric carbon dioxide, but it's just not quite happening yet. We need to have much better policies in place to be able to control emissions primarily in the developed countries. So some of these gases in the atmosphere is important. We want there to be some of them. Without any, they kind of create a blanket around the planet, and without any of that, the blanket that these greenhouse gases provide, the planet would be too cold to support any life. So all of the sunlight that reaches the planet would essentially be reflected back out into space. So it's important to have some of these, a thin layer of this blanket surrounding the planet and being in the atmosphere. But what we're seeing is that this is how for about 650,000 years, the atmospheric concentration of these greenhouse gases remained pretty constant. So this is just showing from the year 0 until around the time of the Industrial Revolution, where industry really started to increase, and we can see that the concentration of these chemicals in the atmosphere have just skyrocketed over the last century. So let's take a look at how carbon dioxide is processed in the environment. This is what we refer to as the carbon cycle. Carbon dioxide being the dominant greenhouse gas, it's the one of greatest focus because it's the most abundant. But this carbon cycle here shows the theme of how it's transferred and transformed through different processes. So we have the fixing of carbon, we call it, through the process of photosynthesis. So this is how CO2 can be taken out of the atmosphere and actually stored in biomass, in plant material. But we also have cellular respiration that's happening by plants and bacteria and animals. So what's being stored in biomass is pretty much kind of evened out by what cellular respiration, breathing back out of carbon dioxide, puts back into the atmosphere. There is some sink of carbon dioxide into the oceans, as we mentioned, but again, those oceans are also have organisms that are doing cellular respiration, which is a contributor of CO2 back into the atmosphere. So if these two cycles were the only ones we saw, the photosynthetic cycle on land and the carbon sink into the ocean, we wouldn't be in such bad shape because basically what's coming in is pretty equal to what's going out. However, we see these other purple arrows, and what these represent is that the combustion of fossil fuels is contributing such a large amount of carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. There's no way that photosynthetic activity or even carbon sinks in the ocean could handle the increase in atmospheric CO2. So the distribution of different types of communities is primarily determined by temperature. We talked about that in chapter 34. The temperature, we can have similar ecosystems on different continents because if the temperature patterns are similar, that's what really sustains those different types of ecosystems. Temperature and rainfall. So as global warming is changing temperatures and precipitation patterns, the distribution of different types of biological communities are also being changed. And it most greatly affects organisms that live at high latitudes because we saw that the northern part of the northern hemisphere is where we're seeing the greatest impact. So we've also seen other effects, things like the frequency of forest fires. There's hundreds of acres, maybe thousands of acres right now in California that are on fire. In mountainous regions, the spring snowmelt would release water into streams that sustain forest moisture levels over the dry summers. But as the springs are arriving earlier, there's less snow, there's less snowmelt, and we have less available moisture in these, already stored in these systems to help combat these fires as they occur. We've also seen that species that live on mountaintops or polar regions essentially just have nowhere to go as their habitats are being lost. We see, polar bears that rely on these ice sheets to be able to stalk their prey. As the ice melts, scientists are finding populations of polar bears that are showing major signs of starvation. There are species of penguins, a couple of species of penguins that are also declining due to the loss of these polar ice sheets. So there are some species that are a little more able to adapt to these different types of climate changes, and we refer to this as what their level of phenotypic plasticity is. And if you remember back in Bio 101, we talked about phenotype, meaning the physical characteristics of an organism, and this is how their phenotypic plasticity is how able they are to change their physical characteristics in response to local environmental conditions. And some this is a microevolution, so it's something that happens at a very slow pace. So as environmental changes are occurring so rapidly, it's unlikely that many species will really be able to adapt as quickly as necessary to be able to handle the type of climate change we're seeing now. So this is a bird called the great tit. This is a European species. And so this is an example of how some species can have a higher phenotypic plasticity. So as this bird lives in areas where temperatures are warming, so what happens is that the leaves on the trees are emerging earlier. The caterpillars that feed on the foliage that's emerging in early spring hatch sooner. And the tits feed on the caterpillars, so they need that food supply of the caterpillars to be able to successfully reproduce. So what scientists are finding is that the birds that are able to lay their eggs earlier and are reproducing earlier have offspring that are surviving better than the ones that are laying their eggs later. So this is showing how this species is adapting to the earlier availability of the food source available to them. There was another study done on a population of red squirrels in the Yukon Territory of Canada, where the spring temperatures have increased by about 2 degrees Celsius in the past 30 years. They found that these guys are breeding earlier, the female squirrels are giving birth about 18 days earlier than they had in the past. And again, this is about that change in the food availability to this species and when successful reproduction could occur. So they're finding that this is one species that has a higher level of phenotypic plasticity. We're going to stop there for today and pick up the part 2 will be posted, I think, later today. So I will send you guys an email when it's ready. Talk to you soon.